Hey, it's Alex Williams with the New Stack. Welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about application development, deployment, and management at scale. Dell Technologies is a unique family of businesses that helps organizations and individuals build their digital future and transform how they work, live, and play. The company provides customers with the industry's broadest and most innovative technology and services portfolio, spanning from edge to core to cloud. Learn more at Dell.com. Okay, here we are at KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon in San Diego. It's day 3 of the event, counting the days that they have keynotes at least. There's lots of other things. I think people started getting here last week on a Friday.
I think so.
Yeah. So it's Thursday and it's getting toward the end of the show. And I mean, I've learned so much, Cornelia, out of this show, and I've had lots of great conversations. And I look forward to sharing those with you. But before I get into it, I want to introduce both Cornelia, who we've had on the show before, is Vice President of Technology at Pivotal. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
And William Geller. And William is responsible for product marketing, HCI for Kubernetes. And he works at Dell EMC. So one of the, I think, the conversations that I really like to start with is, one of the things I think you get out of this show is how people are getting into the thinking about Kubernetes and how do you make that transformation. I think at the beginning of the show, Dan Kahn asked how many people were new to the conference, and I think 80% of the people raised their hands. And this is now a 12,000 person event. And, what to me reflects on is how this cuts across the entire organization, right? And we talked about this at the Spring One Platform Conference about how you might have a C-level executive who is saying, yes, this makes sense. Let's adopt Kubernetes. And then at the bottom of the other end of the spectrum, you have developers and some DevOps engineers saying, yeah, finally, let's do it. And then they're like testing things and they're having just the time of their lives. And somewhere in the middle, there are these business units.
Yep.
And there's these people who are saying, I don't know about that. You need to prove it to me. I think this conference is testament to that. Would you agree? Or
yeah. Oh, without question.
Yeah.
And what is so great about you bringing up that poll, that informal poll, and 80% of the people are new to it, is I think that's actually a great place for us to start the conversation. We'll get back to the executive in a moment, but that person who says, "Great, I finally get to play with Kubernetes," where are they going to start?
Yeah.
So they're going to get started, and they're going to get started extraordinarily easily, because that's something that the Kubernetes community has done extremely well. There are a couple of, MiniKube has been kind of the place to start for many years. There's now also Kind, which actually runs Kubernetes. The former does it on virtual machines, so VirtualBox on your laptop. The other one does it in Docker containers. But the whole point is that with a couple of commands and a simple download and a couple of commands, you're up and running. You can be pushing apps into Kubernetes. And so you're doing that on your own laptop. Or maybe they're going to something like one of the cloud service providers like GKE or Azure or something like that, and they're requesting a cluster and they get the cluster. And it is all just so easy. It just works. And that's brilliant. And I went through that experience myself. And then when the skeptics, or maybe not the skeptics, but the people who are really on the line to make sure this is successful say, hey, well, prove it to me, you need to move off of that MiniKube experience, off of that laptop, or perhaps you have really good reasons for, hey, we want to run our own Kubernetes estate on-prem because we have GPDR issues or some other security issues or something like that. Prove it to me in my data centers. So that initial experience has completely hidden away all of the complexity that's involved in establishing a Kubernetes dial tone, if you will, or a capability. And so then you have to start realizing that that Kubernetes software that I just installed in MiniKube or Google or Azure or AWS provided for me, well, what are they doing? Well, this is just, it's container orchestration, but what else does it need? Well, it needs compute, virtual compute. It needs storage, virtualized storage. It needs networking, virtualized networking. So now, in order to prove it to these people who are on the line for proving the success, prove it to me. I love how you put that. There is my 30-minute experience on MiniKube just turned into 30 days, 3 months. And that can be a really big challenge. And that's what's faced by these 80% of the people that are here.
Yeah, William, I know that you work on VXRail, and that's been co-engineered with VMware. And maybe you could provide some perspective here about how VXRail fits into this equation, where you're looking at business really questions that need to be answered, and how they're thinking about it. What are you hearing from them?
Right. So Cornelia had mentioned this perfectly. I mean, underneath the virtualization layer, there's actual infrastructure, and that really matters still. And what we've done with VXRail is actually develop this appliance with jointly with VMware. So it has VMware inside of it. It's a vSAN that virtualizes the storage. It's for VMware, and it enhances VMware. So it is actually, we're tightly integrated together in this product. And what we're doing is making sure that those resources that are very difficult to sort of corral and make ready for developers and for other users is there. It's automated. It can be lifecycle managed properly when the upgrades are ready. That's been validated and tested, and when those packages for upgrades do come across, they're actually upgraded in a certain sequential order. So we're going from one good state to the next good state. And this is really important because what we're trying to do is to raise the value line above the infrastructure, allow everybody to sort of focus on what's really important with their daily jobs, work on differentiating tasks that are really important to the business, and not worry about what's underneath. So we've got this. And a lot of people who, we've seen it when they come to our booth, a lot of people they start hearing about what it really takes to stand up Kubernetes in production ready. And it's very daunting. You get scared by how much they have to deal with in just making sure that all these resources are available. And they want the workload portability. Well, how do we make sure that all those resources move along with it?
So,
right?
So VXRail then has that virtualized compute. It has that virtualized storage. It has that virtualized networking capability with it.
That's right. Now, as hyper-converged infrastructure, it's software defined. It has all of the virtualization layer using VMware inside. So vSAN, vSphere, and also we have NSX, which does the networking, and also data security built inside, intrinsic from the kernel all the way up the entire stack. And that's really important because as we're moving data and workloads around, making sure that the data is secure all the way across that entire infrastructure, it's incredibly important.
So how are you seeing people use this now?
We've done several things with it. We've partnered with VMware and Pivotal to create something called the Pivotal Ready Architecture. So that was a stack that was built on VXRail, VMware IaaS, and the Pivotal platform on top. So that gave you the full stack. It was a ready-to-go cloud-native app development platform that's been wildly successful. We've been doing this for quite a few years now. And one of the customers who've been really fantastic at using PRA, they've adopted it, was the United States Air Force. And through Raytheon, they wanted to upgrade their ops management system. And usually, the government, it takes a very long time to pretty much develop any type of project and to get through before they succeed or fail, right? So they've adopted Pivotal Ready Architecture, and after 90 days, they had it stood up, and they were already in production, and they were already producing applications, and they were able to push this out to their ops center, which sort of managed refueling of their jets. They were saving $1 million a day after doing this, and they were so excited about it. And as a government, they usually don't like to share a lot of their successes, but they could not stop talking about it. So that was one really exciting way that we're working within Dell Technologies, our family, to produce a solution. The other way is adopting VMware Cloud Foundation, that entire stack, and we're putting that on VXRail, and now with Pivotal VMware PKS, we have a full infrastructure that allows for legacy apps and cloud native apps to be on the same infrastructure at the same time with the same operational consistency.
So let's go back to this scenario where we have the C-level, suite then really wanting to push digital transformation, let's just say. And then we have these engineers who are saying, yeah, let's do it. And now we have those people in the business group saying, prove it. How does managed infrastructure help prove it? What does that provide in terms of a comfort for those managers? Because you're still needing DevOps and workflows to really make the most of this architecture.
Yep. And so I love the fact that you use this term value line, because you were describing a value line that was really about infrastructure and platform. Now, what you just described with the Air Force, and those are very good friends of mine. I've been working with the Air Force, and they have been very public about the successes that they've had at Kessel Run in particular. So that's the first application that you talked about there. Is that ultimately their successes are all about serving the warfighter. Their success is not about running infrastructure in a great way. But you described a value line that's really helping the people who are providing that platform capability provide that platform capability in a much easier way. Now, Alex, what you're bringing us back to is now that application that you described, that had to be built using agile practices, using DevOps practices, being able to bring that, get feedback back, and so on. And that's really where the applications that have been designed by Pivotal and VMware in terms of an application platform and a Kubernetes-based platform come into play. Because there's a whole nother value line there. This value line allows application teams to now focus on that application that's serving the warfighter or serving some other part of business consumer, depending on which commercial or military applications. It allows them to focus on that, doing the rapid iteration without even having to worry about how the platform is managed. So we've really got a series of value lines. It's almost like we're doing DevOps at the platform level so that we can enable DevOps at the application tier.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you start thinking about the relationships, and one of the discussions we had earlier in the week was about project. Oh, I'm going to forget. It's a project.
Pacific?
No, the data recovery project. Veritas. Let's take a quick. Valero. Yeah.
Yes.
We're talking about Project Valero and how it's really been for data recovery, and you can do these instant backups, and that's excellent. That offers a lot of opportunities there. But I asked them, I said, but what, so how do the developer feel about that? Like, well, the developer really is, they want it to work, right? I said, well, how the storage administrator feel about it? I said, well, that's a different story. And I'm like, well, tell me about that. And we talked then about, well, then how do you start working across these boundaries? And, and it becomes very much of kind of a community type of exercise. Does the community exercise change at all in these environments we're talking about with managed infrastructure? Or are the community exercises one and the same?
And maybe the way that I would even pose the question to you, William, is that when we hyper-converge the infrastructure, are we hyper-converging the operational models and the people?
That's a good question. What we end up having is those that are managing DevOps and IT ops, they'll still manage all of that infrastructure, but you still have those different layers. Everybody wants to, say, get to a digital transformation or adopt cloud native, but they all have a different idea of how to get there, and they don't often sort of align. So you have developers who want to do it a certain way. They're going to get a Kubernetes dial tone no matter how they end up getting it, while we have more conservative IT ops who go, whoa, wait a minute. We want to make sure that we control what resources are given out, where that data is stored, what tools are being used. But we're finding them coming closer together. So as we are able to, say, automate a lot of these operational activities underneath and again, raise that value line, to coin a word, you're finding that we're not spending so many resources in order to manage all of that infrastructure, but being able to give those resources as the developers need at their speed. So developers are happy, the IT ops guys are happy, and because they're focusing on differentiating tasks, that means they're focusing on what really drives business value. So now the C-suite is becoming more happy. So this is really bringing a lot of the organization together much more.
So when you think about that, and you think about then workload mobility, I'm curious about how you think about workload mobility. How is that, how does that fit into the context here? In terms of workload mobility, in terms of, we still live in a multi-cloud environment.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's, it used to be a belief that we must go to the public cloud. That is the place where we have to save money, to be more agile. But now we're finding that people are moving those workloads back on-prem, but that still doesn't solve the problem. We have a myriad of different clouds, different tool sets, different places, and really with workload mobility, the workload needs to be in a location that's best for that workload, the cost-wise, tool set-wise, just depending on where it needs to be. So the idea is not to take away any of those options, but to allow them to have that mobility, to move that workload anywhere that it needs to be. And it also helps with data security. So if you're moving that workload closer to where the data is, as opposed to the other way around, you've now shrank that attack surface, and it becomes much more secure in data. So we talk about GDPR, which has a very hefty price tag if you ever violate that, or PCI. Businesses want to start avoiding things like that. So we'll just move the workload there. We'll move non-business critical workloads into the cloud, and ones that need a little bit more fluctuating of resources, and we'll keep the ones that are business critical and secure on-prem. Make it work.
And if I could add to that, actually, I love the fact that you used both the term workload mobility very closely in proximity to mention of Velero. Because Velero, I think, is very interesting in that initially it was called a backup recovery tool. But when we start to think about workload mobility, what Velero is doing is it's essentially doing workload backup and workload recovery. And so now when we think about that, instead of just being an old traditional backup recovery, we're going to back up in case of disaster, that now actually becomes an important lever in achieving that mobility. And so if you think of Kubernetes clusters as the endpoint, you now have a workload mobility tool. It's almost like vMotion, but for Kubernetes. So that's really where something like Velero comes into play. So the Kubernetes cluster itself isn't necessarily this thing that lives forever. The workload is what's really important, and we can move that around using tools like Velero.
And you can then look at the workloads in a different manner too, because you can look at the data associated with the workloads and start doing measurements accordingly, which then can play into practices that are evolving, such as observability.
Yep, that's right.
And so what is the role of VMware Cloud Foundation? this is a term that I've heard a little bit about, but I'm curious on how it fits in with all this.
Well, VMware Cloud Foundation is actually a full stack of VMware products altogether. Now, with that sitting on top of VXRail, we have a special integration that we've worked with VMware engineers. And so through a single pane of glass using SDDC Manager, you're able to actually run the lifecycle management across the entire stack, including across the VXRail, because it talks directly to our manager inside. You can also deploy clusters and then be able to manage them. So it is one single pane of glass to sort of manage that entire infrastructure from end to end, whether in core or in at edge locations, or even the different clouds that you start managing workload mobility to.
Okay. So when we're thinking about that, in terms of how we think about hyper-converged infrastructure, what are some of the new use cases that are emerging?
Well, we have, of course, the supporting cloud-native architectures. A lot of the use cases for hyperconverged have been mostly virtual desktops, VDI. But we're also starting to see big data being supported and a lot of business-critical apps. And to go back to VCF on VXRail, because it's the infrastructure that supports both the legacy apps as well as cloud native, you can support the business critical apps, and you can still adopt cloud native at the same time. So businesses that would adopt both of these and using VMware PKS for Kubernetes workloads on VCF, their businesses are able to adopt cloud native at their own pace. So they can manage both the legacy apps, adopt cloud native at their own pace. If they decide they want to refactor some of those apps over time, they can do that at their own pace without sort of breaking the infrastructure that they have already and without making huge investments in maintaining both of these infrastructure at the same time.
Yeah, so to clarify, what we're talking about here is not a Kubernetes platform. It is a platform that will run a number of different workloads.
Right, yeah.
You might be running VM-based workloads, you might be running Kubernetes-based workloads. All of those things can be supported on the same infrastructure stack.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
How do these architectures remind you of the early days when you were working on mainframes and you were working on these architectures? Because we talked about this at Spring One a little bit, and I thought it was fascinating to hear kind of the perspectives you had about how, what kind of compute you were able to use, what kind of networking you're able to use, really, and what the storage capabilities were. What are some of the things that strike you now about hyper-converged infrastructure in comparison to those times, and what makes this exciting now?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that I'm in the blissful position of coming at it from an application developer perspective.
Yes.
And so I love Kubernetes in the fact that it abstracts that all away from me.
Right.
I don't have to make those decisions. And we used to, as a software development team, we used to have to know a great deal about the infrastructure and, quite frankly, the
Right.
middleware stack. So when we built an application that depended on pub/sub, we had to make the decision ahead of time that we were going to use JMS. And that was going to be the protocol. And that was, and we made those decisions. And in fact, we got all the way down to we were probably using WebSphere or, a very specific language. Now, we've still had to make some of those decisions, both at the middleware layer and when we were developing on something like VMs, those decisions, that virtualization layer was set out, and we sometimes exploited the details of those. By Kubernetes coming along, it creates this abstraction that allows me to just say, hey, I need a storage volume. And I don't have to worry about provisioning it anymore, and I don't have to worry about the APIs of accessing it and so on. So that's from the application developer perspective, and I think it's turtles all the way down, right? So it's all about abstractions.
That's right. So just having the infrastructure out there underneath, now once we virtualize it, and it's just about how we abstract that out. Again, we're just looking to raise that, raise the value line up, so it becomes nothing to worry about as far as just how do we abstract that out for the value that we're trying to build off of it.
So now we're moving forward, looking at beyond KubeCon really. And at VMworld, we learned a lot about Tanzu and Project Pacific. I'm curious how they fit into this discussion we're having.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just take a couple minutes to talk about Tanzu
Yeah.
and Project Pacific, and then I'll let William kind of address how that relates to what we've been talking about so far. So what Tanzu and Project Pacific, but really Tanzu overall, represents to me, and once I really kind of deeply grokked it, I realized that it's really just an evolution of the virtualization that VMware started more than 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, VMware started virtualizing compute. And then, of course, as we talked about, they've added virtualized storage, virtualized networking, and so on. And containers don't they don't represent the new virtualization stack. They really represent an expansion of it. And I'll tell you, I've been working with VMware long enough to know that a number of years ago, I think as containers were really starting to emerge, or actually starting to show that, oh, this is a very, very valuable abstraction, virtualized abstraction, that initially it was thought of as a layer that you just put on top of VMs. But it's not a layer on top of VMs, it's side. It's almost like we have virtualized compute, virtualized, let me rephrase, virtualized hosts, virtualized storage, virtualized network, virtualized containers. They're side by side instead of layered. And I think that a number of years ago, we thought of it as a layer on top.
Right.
But it's really side by side. And so Tanzu represents that. And in fact, Project Pacific, which is all about vSphere expanded to include, it isn't only containers, it's really an expansion of virtualization to include containers, so that you can now use vCenter and the APIs that VI admins have been using for a long time. You can create a VM, you can create a virtualized storage volume, you can create a Kubernetes cluster, you can create a Kubernetes namespace. These are all virtualized abstractions that are now part of the virtualization platform that VMware provides. So that's really what Project Pacific and Tanzu represents to me, which I think already has some parallels to what we've been talking about here.
Yeah, it does. So having that infrastructure we'd already talked about, that was for all different types of apps. And now VMware sort of filled in a lot of those gaps at their layer. So and we find it's incredibly exciting with that announcement, because we're so in lockstep with VMware that we have a sort of a SIM-ship agreement with them, with vSphere, when 30 days after it goes live. It's already validated and tested on VXRail. So those customers who want to adopt Project Pacific, once it goes live, 30 days later, they're able to pull it in and begin doing Kubernetes and running other apps through VMs and doing also concurrently. So it's a really exciting time of what's coming up.
It is exciting. It's interesting too, because when you think about these like projects such as Tanzu, you think then about what is even the next step beyond container technologies. And one of the conversations we had earlier was with James Waters, and we were talking about event streaming architectures. And how do you see the evolution of event streaming architectures, and does this apply to the architectures we're talking about in terms of the VXRail?
Oh, that is a super interesting question. And given that you've posed it in this context where we just had this conversation about expanding sideways instead of layering on top, expanding sideways, imagine, and in fact, I'll go back to the asynchronous, pub sub. Imagine now, instead of that being a middleware layer that's layered on top of infrastructure, it's just an abstraction that's available. When you think about it, an event streaming, so event streams require some type of an event source, some type of a storage and mechanism for having those streams recorded and available for consumption. If that was just an inherent part, not layered on top, but an inherent part of all of the tools that we have available to build these applications in a modern way, I think that's the win.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk today. I think you have a book in your lap there.
Right. So before we stop, I wanted to promote Cornelia's book. It just came out.
Hey, I got one too.
Cloud Native Patterns. Amazingly, she had a book signing here at KubeCon. It was a very long line of very happy customers. Even though they had the book, everybody wanted to have it signed, and it's full of a lot of really good reads.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
And I'm really looking forward to taking a look at this. I had the opportunity to talk to Cornelia at the Spring One conference and just really enjoyed the conversation. And you were citing this book quite a bit, and so I highly recommend it. Cloud Native Patterns by Cornelia Davis and a foreword by Gene Kim.
Yes.
Oh, nice. Great. Okay, well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dell Technologies is a unique family of businesses that helps organizations and individuals build their digital future and transform how they work, live, and play. The company provides customers with the industry's broadest and most innovative technology and services portfolio, spanning from edge to core to cloud. Learn more at Dell.com. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.